Chapter 3 Lost in the Wild Woods. The path was winding and at times contorted itself round low-hung branches and fallen tree stumps. Sometimes it was as narrow as a rabbit run, sometimes so broad that it seemed to fade entirely, but the pendant pulsed only in its true direction. Tally felt a growing sense of excited anticipation. What would the next turn bring? She must catch up with the flaxen-haired girl soon. Perhaps in return for the key she could tell Tally the way home. This thought surprised Tally. With every step, the familiarity of home, however awful, was becoming more and more appealing. As she pondered this fact and pushed further along the path, the undergrowth around her was growing more dense and impenetrable. A low humming, barely audible, seemed to be vibrating along the branches she touched. The darkness was invading. She looked down at the pendant hanging from her neck, but could see only the faintest spark dancing unevenly. No match now for the night. Worried she had taken a wrong turn, she swung to face the direction that she had come. To her alarm, the path had vanished, and the pendant now seemed extinguished entirely. Something brushed her arm, then encircled it. A hand, perhaps. Tally turned again, and the lasso-like grip tightened. She lunged forward, suddenly terrified, as another tendril ensnared a leg, rooting her. She raised her arm, realizing stillness was a mistake, and met with a slender branch, which seemed to bow and twine with her fingers as though entering into some bizarre courting ritual. The humming was growing louder, became a buzzing, tangibly felt along the woody limbs that were closing in around Tally's bodies. The trees! They were moving! They were swaying around her, more tendrils of woody vine reaching out to her, searching for her own fleshy branches. They were tightening their tangled net. She felt the exclamation rising through her body before it erupted from her lips. No! And the fire of survival surged through her veins, heating up her blood, giving her almost Herculean strength. She lunged forward against her binds, breaking free and pushing against the stems that sought her heat. She threw herself blindly forward, lurching against shaking boughs and lifting tree trunks. The forest was moving in, but she was moving forward. Roots ripped themselves from the musty ground and tripped her as she passed, and the vice-like humming was inside her mind and buzzed the air that she gasped. She shook her head and pushed on, anger fighting fear. And then, the miracle that she needed, the moon broke free from the clouds. It poured pale, ghostly light amongst those ghoulish wooden skeletons, flooding clear earth only footfalls away. The last tendril to grab her coiled around her neck, and instinctively she reached for the pendant hanging on its rough leather cord over her heart. She felt the noosed tendril tightening, then a ripping sensation, but she plunged on into free space. Eventually, the flaming energy in her limbs subsided. Tally slowed her pace, while behind her the silhouettes of writhing trees bobbed about in the moonlight, and the humming became more faint. The severed forest vine around her neck hung loosely now, detached from its roving parent. She loosened its grip, wriggled free from its lifeless clutches, and opened the hand that held the pendant. She was relieved to see it was once again glowing, pale moon sparks from within its blackness. As she moved swiftly across the moonlight clearing, Tally could see the shadow of a rocky outcrop emerging from the darkness. She felt waves of relief weaken her legs, and her pace slowed. The stars glittered pityingly in the cold night sky, and she pulled her cardigan around herself, shivering against the icy wind. The memory of the temporary warmth of her own bed seemed so appealing. If she headed for the rocks and climbed upwards, perhaps the height would offer her clues about this strange landscape she was battling with. Then she could find some shelter amongst their crevices and wait for morning. Her feet were sore and numb, so at first she was not aware of the muddy clay that was oozing up between her toes with every step that she took. But soon the waterlogged grass beneath her feet turned to pure mud, and she was mired up to her ankles. Clouds were scudding across the face of the moon again, and the ghostly grey sheen of the marsh flashed in and out of her existence before her. She began to stagger with the weight of mud sucking her downward, grasping at clumps of spear-like marsh grass to regain her balance. She felt her energy draining away with every laborious step. To her relief, mossy tussocks began to rise up around her in the quagmire, plump and soft. If she could just stay upright long enough to mount one, she could weave her way, tussock by tussock, across the boggy expanse. The first tussock she chose was broad. The moss that covered it was deep and warmer to touch than Tallis was expecting. She grasped a great handful to tug herself up, and the tussock seemed to shudder beneath her grip. But once aboard, she moved cautiously from knees to feet and looked around her for the next moss-covered mound. This was smaller in diameter and a little taller. She placed one foot onto its apex, and as she transferred her weight, it sunk a little. She moved quickly forward onto a broader tussock, squatting to her left. This time there was a tipping sensation, first one way and then another. She cried out and teetered, precariously close to falling back into the bog, and a grunt rose from below her as if echoing her cry at a much lower pitch. Now Tallis saw her foolishness in trusting her eyes and the world beneath her feet. The tussocks all around her began to vibrate. Some were rocking, and more strange grunting noises were bubbling up from the swampy sludge they were sitting in. These were not tussocks of earth and moss. These were living creatures with hunched, mossy backs and heads and bulging eyes and lips and chins that began to protrude from beneath the mud. Tallis understood at once the danger that she was in. The pendant round her neck seemed to glow brighter, as if responding to the panic that was rising within her heart. Some of the bog creatures were slower to awaken to the disturbance she had caused. She desperately needed to find those still sleeping and focus on forward movement. But slimy elbows and knees were untangling themselves from the mossy balls of filth around her. They were rising up on spindly, bowing legs that moved effortlessly across the marshland towards her in the moonlight. The bog creatures were muttering now, grunts turning into an unintelligible stream of language that Tallis did not understand. Their tone was angry, though, that much she gathered. They were clearly not going to offer her the bridge to safety she so ardently desired. She froze for a moment. Images of Valerie's cross face flashed before her mind's eye. Was this punishment? Did she deserve to die a smothering death at the bottom of the bog? Then the tussock beneath her lurched, and she fell forward, reaching for another. Scrambling on board, she clung on as it too began to sway, and now Gran's voice came to her on the murky air. "It's never as bad as it seems, child." She gathered all her strength and plunged on to the next shuddering back, ignoring the rumbling noises erupting from the mud. And the next, and the next. One tussock reared up beneath her frantic grip, and she slid backwards onto another, but still she crawled and squirmed and lunged across the boggart field. The solid outline of the rocky crags growing taller and taller. She was outpacing the fastest of the bog creatures now, and the tussocks were becoming firmer, fewer and further apart. Soon she would have to trust the swampy depths and wade to solid ground. The tussock beneath her gave only the hint of a vibration, and bubbles rose up from the muddy depths carrying sonorous snores. She glanced down at the pendant. The pale light within its black surface was pulsing strongly. She stepped onto another firm, round tussock, and another, but now the options were fewer and further between. At last it seemed she had reached the other side. Willingly, she plunged a foot into the freezing marsh water. Toes, sole, heel, ankle, calf, knee were submerged in the sludge before she felt a sense of solidity beneath her. She moved slowly, cautiously, lest she fall. At this depth the marsh could still claim her for its own. And indeed, it had not finished with her yet. Tallis unwittingly balanced herself between two final smaller tussocks as she waded forward, and before she knew it, she was on her back, lashing and flailing to keep her head above the filthy soup. A sinewy, claw-like hand was clipped suddenly around one of her ankles, and as the waking bog creature uncurled itself, full of rage at being disturbed from its muddy slumber, it roared and woke its neighbour, whose spiny elbow swung free of the bog, and whose fingers closed around Tally's mud-blackened hair. She lay as if defeated for a moment, like a torture victim on the rack, as the bog creatures pulled their prize in opposite directions. Then, With a last surge of energy and determination, she began to struggle and kick. She had not got this far to be torn to two or to sink without a trace. She would not give up without a fight. Tally knew her strength would not last long, and her eyes flashed desperately into the darkness, seeking help. She knew she was doomed if she continued her struggle alone, and miraculously, it seemed, help was on its way. The rocky outcrop was broken by silhouettes moving along its length, superhuman figures that turned at the commotion below and lurched swiftly towards the marsh. Tally could feel the waves of mud as her hulking rescuers entered the bogland, and she heard snatches of strange words booming on the wind. The tugging at her body beneath the mud slowed as attention was diverted. Then an almighty sucking noise circled around her as she saw in faded moonlight her saviours. They grabbed the monstrous hands, with monstrous hands a boggart each, as if plucking marsh reeds from their watery roots. Then they hurled them like mud balls into the mass of stalking bog creatures she had left behind. The wall of shrieking and screaming emitted as they fell mingled with Tally's own desperate cries, followed by gurgling wails as they coiled in on themselves and sunk back into the mud. The marsh was once more just a marsh, but Tally was drowning. Her arms and legs flailed aimlessly in the sea of sludge, and she gasped for precious air each time she surfaced. Her rescuers seemed hesitant. What was this slithering, black-limbed creature that spluttered and shrieked? Might it nip or sting, claw or bite? A chubby finger poked the near-lifeless body. It squirmed. There was a chuckle, and more fingers scooping up the prize, which hung limply, mud dripping from its arms and legs. Awareness dissipated and Tally's senses shut down as clumsy fingers lifted a yawning leather flap and bundled her into total darkness. Time passed with a swaying movement, but Tally had no idea how long or how far she had travelled when motion ceased. The booming voices, slightly muffled by the leather walls that encased her, started up again, gruff and at times argumentative. The sound of an axe sliced through the darkness. Before long she heard the distinctive crackling of flames, and a growing warmth inside her leathery prison revived her slightly. What was to become of her now? How could she explain her plight to her rescuers without a common tongue? Were these hulking giants indeed rescuers, or just another enemy to escape from? She moved her fingers and toes tentatively, worried that movement might remind her captors of their prize. Though she felt battered and bruised, nothing seemed broken. She bent her neck and looked down beyond her chin. No glowing light from the pendant. Was it even there anymore? She moved her hand to her chest and met crystalline coldness. She had not lost it then. She sighed with relief. But why was it no longer glowing? This question brought a tumble of other questions. How and why did the pendant glow? Where was she? And why was this strange world so alive and hostile? Was this the place Gran had taken her to so many times in her imagination? But in reality, how could trees move? Why had she never met bog creatures before, or seen giants in the real world? If this world existed, was there such a thing as a real world? Gran's words echoed in her head. My dear girl, with imagination, you can create your world anew. Her musings were cut short by a jolt. Fumbling fingers the size of tree trunks reached into the folds of leather that encased her. She squeaked as the fingers prodded her, then lifted her in a vice-like grip. The crushing pressure across her chest eased slightly, and she was aware of two great eyeballs glinting and looking down at her in the moonlight. The troll chuckled, and his hairy nostrils appeared over the edge of the leathery pouch. He lifted the bedraggled creature that he had plucked from the boggart's mire and surveyed his catch. Scrawny. A darkling child, perhaps, though strangely clothed. He sat the thing carefully, almost tenderly, on the prairie of his chubby palm. It was babbling now, in a high-pitched trill, like a little songbird. The troll chuckled again. His palm shook, and the little creature staggered and dropped to its knees, shielding itself from his booming approval. Tally covered her ears as the two trolls exchanged words, which became louder and more aggressive as the conversation continued. The larger and uglier of the two, who sat tending the small bonfire they had built, gesticulated towards the flames with a stick and seemed most displeased. Her captor backed into the shadow of a boulder, muttering and cupping her in both hands now, like a rare butterfly caught on a summer's day. Tallis sensed the danger before it struck, and then her fleshy cage was rattling her side to side and up and down. Between the pudgy fingers she could see the bigger troll's fat belly wobbling towards them, protruding over a metal belt buckle, and she felt the aftershock from every one of the blows that he rained down on her captor. But defending his prize without his hands made her captor as vulnerable as she was, and as he crashed to the ground his fingers were ripped apart by his assailant. She was plucked up feet first and dangled high above the rocky ground. Her rescuers lurched to his feet and lunged at his stolen prize as she swung dangerously close to the flames of the waiting fire. She could see no way out and closed her eyes to the spiralling picture around her as she was jiggled like bait on a line. Her cardigan, matted with mud, wrapped itself around her head and muffled her cries for help. Something clinked, metal on stone, directly below her waving arms, and suddenly she was in free fall. She landed with a soft thud on coarse burlap and opened her eyes. The trolls were hopscotching backwards, pointing in terror at a small boulder just in front of where Tallie lay. She sat up, prepared to back away from some giant horned beetle, many-legged spider, or other strange magical creature of the night that she had not yet encountered here. But the boulder top was bare, save for the strange key she had picked up from her bedroom. Floor, it glinted in the moonlight, which reminded Tallie of the pendant. Yes, it was still hanging safely from its tough leather cord around her neck. She snatched up the key, and both trolls raised their arms across their faces, as if to protect themselves from some great fireball. The key to freedom is always easier to find than you think. Once more Gran's words wafted to her on the night breeze, and she afforded herself a smile before skipping between boulders into the darkness.